tonight we have two people who need no introduction. They have been active in our congregation, and they've been up here before during this series. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Phil Eaton and Dr. Mark Eaton. Would you two come on up? Okay. Mark's going to begin. By the way, Phil, I understand you did some book signing today for... Good. And you have some books here, I hope? Okay, so there are books. Dr. Phil Eaton's most recent book is right over here on saying what we believe in an age of unbelief. Hope you'll pick one up. Mark.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Great.
Oh, you've got a mic, don't you?
I think I'm going to use this one, yeah. So we're good, Brandon? Yeah, you guys can all hear me? All right, so first off, it's been a real privilege and an honor to be part of this whole series. I think it's been outstanding. A lot of people have sort of persisted with us all the way through, and I think we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot myself. So I think what I'd like to do to start us off tonight, I'm going to do a little bit of sort of review and think about where we've been over the course of this whole series on the Protestant Reformation. And then I'll kind of bring it up to at least the 20th century with a writer that I admire a lot named Flannery O'Connor, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of how she understands what it means to be a Christian in a secular age. And I think I'm hoping that that will be a kind of a good segue into what my dad has for us tonight. And so he'll come up after me. I'll try not to take too much time to start us off. So over the past few weeks, we've learned a lot about how the Protestant Reformation sort of radiated outward from several points of origin in the 16th century, from Martin Luther in Germany, John Calvin in Switzerland, John Knox in Scotland, and Thomas Cranmer in England. And from those points of origin, these reformers and their associates helped to bring a new reformed Christianity to many parts of the world. We learned about two of the leading doctrines of the Reformation, sola scriptura, scripture alone, and sola fide, faith alone. We saw how a small group of English pilgrims, so this was the start of our second half of the series this spring, and we started with the American colonists. We saw how a small group of English pilgrims, or separatists, arrived in Massachusetts on the Mayflower in 1620 and founded Plymouth Plantation, a settlement devoted to religious life under William Bradford, whose book of Plymouth Plantation is a classic of early American literature. We also saw how there's Plymouth Plantation today. We also saw how a second, much larger group of Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 1630 and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Not so much separatists as religious dissidents, they sought to purify the Church of England by establishing a model Christian community, a city upon a hill, as John Winthrop famously put it in his sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, from 1630, that would set a godly example for all the world to emulate. And so a quotation, here's John Winthrop landing at Salem, 1630, an illustration of that. Quoting from Winthrop, "He shall make us a praise and glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us." So we then discussed how the colonists soon ran into serious disagreements over theological doctrines, such as the doctrine of election. Anne Hutchinson, who you see here, the daughter of a minister, invited women to come to her home to discuss religion shortly after migrating to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These meetings became very popular, and a number of men also began to attend. Hutchinson disagreed with the teachings of some ministers who she claimed depended too heavily on the covenant of works that promised salvation if one obeyed moral law. She adhered to the teachings of Reverend John Cotton, who you see here, who placed more emphasis on the covenant of grace that required an active faith and softened the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. She was called before the General Court of the colony, as you recall, and questioned by Governor John Winthrop himself and other government leaders. This gets to the Salem witch trials, so I'll go back to John Cotton there. So she was called before the General Court, and during the trial, you remember, Anne Hutchinson testified that she had had a revelation directly from God, which was sort of anathema to the Puritans. The court concluded that she was guilty of heresy and banished her from the colony. She settled in Rhode Island, a colony founded by Roger Williams, another religious dissenter. This episode is known as the Antinomian Controversy of 1636 to 1638. Another well-known controversy, of course, was the Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693, which began when a group of young girls in Salem Village claimed to be tormented by witches. Within months, 140 people stood accused of practicing witchcraft in communities surrounding Boston. The now infamous Court of Oyer and Terminer was called to hear accusations of witchcraft, and they agreed to admit so-called spectral evidence. You remember this term from my presentation last time. Spectral evidence from witnesses who testified that the spirits of the accused tormented them. 19 individuals were hanged, and one man was pressed to death. Several others died in prison. By the end of the trials, many of those involved had begun to doubt whether all those condemned were in fact witches. Increase Mather himself, here's Increase Mather. Increase Mather himself cautioned, quote, "If it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, then one innocent person should be condemned," end quote. So the trial of Anne Hutchinson and the witchcraft trials of Salem Village hold important lessons for us today about social conformity and religious pluralism, but I should emphasize that many scholars today are challenging the still prevalent view of Puritans as intolerant fundamentalists. So David D. Hall has argued in his book, A Reforming People, for instance, that while the Puritans by no means endorsed the premises of liberalism or democracy, they were nonetheless reform-minded. He says that the Puritanism in these pages, the pages of his book, does not coincide with the entrenched opinion that the movement was authoritarian or theocratic. From the 1640s onward, according to Hall, the colonists worried that they were already facing challenges, conflicts, and divisions that threatened the near-perfect community that they had at first envisioned. You remember back to Winthrop's A Model for Christian Charity. They envisioned this sort of almost utopia that they were going to try to establish. And that was an aspiration that shaped and strengthened by their hopes of carrying out a long-awaited further reformation of the church. Ministers and lay people looked first to congregations as the place where love, mutuality, and righteousness would flourish. This is Hall. So in short, their vision was a vision for a better world. Similarly, in his book, Sympathetic Puritans, Abram Van Engen contends that Puritanism was a social movement focused on tight-knit communities in which mutual affections and sympathy were necessary for the common good. Let's see, I think I have a quotation from Van Engen here. Indeed, the experience of grace mattered so much to the Puritans that it actually determined the political and social elements of their religious movement. The godly needed each other for grace, and precisely because the Lord used the godly to deliver his grace, the community of Puritan saints embraced a spiritual unity that rejected the unregenerate. They bound themselves together and separated themselves from others. Puritanism was a way of life that collected together groups of the godly, identified them as distinct, and called on them to live lives of holiness in pursuit of wider reform, precisely so that a reformed church and society could nourish the piety and devotion aimed at true conversion and assurance. So the New England churches sought to be more rigorous than other churches, and their primary distinguishing feature was this covenant of grace that I talked about earlier. But unfortunately, I think that covenant of grace did contribute to a feeling that they were a special few. But what I'm trying to do is just to say that the historians today, I think, are trying to take a more sort of balanced view of the Puritans and try to understand their aspirations as well as their shortcomings, okay? So now I'm gonna, ideally I would have liked to maybe talk a little bit about the intervening years, like the Great Awakening of the 1700s, for example, and sort of how we got to the late 20th century and now the early 21st century. But I want to just jump forward more than 200 years now to think about what Charles Taylor has influentially called a secular age. So what is it about our culture and society today that is very different from the one in which the Puritans lived? So for Taylor, the problem of religious belief in a secular age is that the sort of epistemological and metaphysical assumptions of modernity, what he calls the immanent frame that we all sort of live in, that it has made religious beliefs much more private, okay, and less kind of corporate and taken for granted, okay? It does not, religious belief for Taylor does not have the same kind of taken for granted force that it once did. And so Taylor explains this idea that we're now living in a secular age. He explains it this way. He says, so what I want to do is examine our society as secular in this third sense. He starts out with like two different versions of secularity, but he really wants to talk about this third version of what it means to be secular, which I could perhaps encapsulate in this way. The change I want to define and trace is one which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. Belief in God is no longer axiomatic. There are alternatives. And this will also mean that at least in certain milieu, it may be hard to sustain one's faith. There will be people who feel bound to give it up even though they mourn its loss. This has been a recognizable experience in our societies, at least since the mid-19th century. There will be many others to whom faith never even seems an eligible possibility. There are certainly millions today for whom this is true. So he's trying to describe a change in which religious faith was more taken for granted to one in which it's kind of more tenuous, all right, and more optional, more private, a private choice, okay? So another consequence of secularization, I think, is that we now understand belief as something closer to like a philosophical position rather than a religious practice. Something we think rather than do, or rather something we think is true as opposed to false. And the historian Wilfred Cantwell Smith writes about this. He says, indeed, one might perhaps sum up one aspect of the history of these matters over the past few centuries in the following way. The affirmation, I believe in God, used to mean, given the reality of God as a fact of the universe, notice taken for granted, axiomatic. The reality of God is a fact of the universe. I hereby pledge to him my heart and soul. I committedly opt to live in loyalty to him. I offer my life to be judged by him, trusting his mercy. So that would be one version of what it once meant to believe. Today, the statement might be taken by some as meaning this: given the uncertainty as to whether there is a God or not, as a fact of modern life, I announce that my opinion is yes. So this formulation by Smith, I think, captures a kind of shift away from a religion as belonging to a community, practicing one's faith, to religion as believing, such that the question whether God exists or not looms larger than ever before in what defines faith. So I think that's been a shift over the past 2 centuries that has brought us to what Taylor calls a secular age. The late Roger Lundeen, who was a friend of mine and taught at Wheaton College, he wrote a book called Believing Again, Doubt and Faith in a Secular Age that came out in 2009. And in that book, he writes, to be a modern believer is to recognize that in the deepest personal sense, belief is optional. Whatever a person is able to accept or affirm, he or she is also free to reject or deny. So notice how similar that is to how Taylor defined a secular age, okay? So Flannery O'Connor is a writer. Some of you have read her and know her. I think she's a writer who really understands that the place of religion in modern society is fundamentally different than it was in the past. Okay, so for example, in her book, Mystery and Manners, she describes the conditions for holding religious beliefs in very similar terms as Charles Taylor does in A Secular Age. So here she is. For the last few centuries, she writes, we have lived in a world which has been increasingly convinced that the reaches of reality end very close to the surface, that there is no ultimate divine source, that the things of this world do not pour forth from God. And then again, in a letter she wrote to a college student who had heard her speak at Emory University in 1962, and wrote to Flannery O'Connor saying that he was having doubts about his faith, O'Connor responded to this young college student this way: I think that this experience you are having of losing your faith, or as you think of having lost it, is an experience that in the long run belongs to faith. She then goes on to say, I don't know how the kind of faith required of the Christian living in the 20th century can be at all if it is not grounded in this experience you are having right now of unbelief. So I think that what I get from O'Connor is that not only that she took the kind of viability of unbelief in a secular age very seriously, But she also believed very strongly, I think, that unbelief and belief kind of went hand in hand, that they weren't necessarily opposites, but part of the same thing, okay? But she also envisioned herself, Flannery O'Connor did, as a sort of spokesperson for the Christian faith in a secular age, a writer who was uniquely qualified to make belief believable to the reader. So she wanted to make her fiction reflect a stronger version of religious faith than the vaporous and sentimental forms of faith she found so prevalent in mid-20th century America. So here in an essay, she writes, "I am no disbeliever in spiritual purpose and no vague believer. I see from the standpoint of Christian orthodoxy. This means that for me, the meaning of life is centered in our redemption by Christ, and that what I see in the world, I see in its relation to that. I don't think this is a position that can be taken halfway, or one that is particularly easy in these times to make transparent in fiction." So you see how she's kind of announcing and articulating her faith proudly. And this, I think, gets to the heart of O'Connor's approach to fiction, her sort of artistic statement of faith, as it were. Her fiction, her novels and short stories explore what it means to live as a Christian in a secular age. Being true to one's Christian faith has become, in effect, countercultural as well as challenging. Here she says, no, this is my last quote. Here's another quote from her. "If you are going to stand up intellectually to agnostics, then intellectual difficulties will have to be met, and you will be meeting them for the rest of your life. But faith is what you have in the absence of knowledge." And here O'Connor is writing, in this last quotation, she's writing to a close friend of hers named Betty Hester. And again, she tells her friend Betty that, doubt is not something to be feared. In some ways, it's something to be embraced as integral to one's faith. So here's the quote that I'm going to end with. She says, "When I ask myself how I believe, I have no satisfactory answer, no assurances at all, no feeling at all. I can only say with Peter, 'Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.' All I can say about my love of God is, 'Lord, help me in the lack of it.'" So that, I'm going to end with that, and just with Flannery O'Connor as a good example of someone who is really trying to say, this is how to articulate your faith, to wear your faith in a secular age. So thanks. I'll turn it over to Dad now.
All right, we're in business. You all need to understand how wonderful it is to be sharing a platform with my son. It is very cool. And what is astounding to me in hearing him present what he's just presented, he may not feel comfortable with this, but how much we think together alike. We do a lot of reading of the same kinds of things. I learn a great deal from him about what ought to be read. He sometimes picks things up from me about what ought to be read, and we share a great deal in common in terms of the way we look at the world and history and our lives and Christian life and all of that. And this is just thrilling to me. Mark and I started out, it'll be kind of interesting for you to see what this is, how much overlap there is, and perhaps some of the differences there may be. But we started out saying, okay, let's, and in talking with Jeff, even at the very beginnings of planning all of this, we started out by saying, well, let's end this by sort of reviewing, reflecting back about the Reformation, all of what we've learned together and been thinking about and been reading and rereading and all of that. So let's just sort of concluding reflections on the Reformation, but let's also try to bring it into our own moment in time, where we are today. So that's what we're trying to do, and that's what Mark just marvelously did, and sets me up well, although I'm going to re-quote a couple of the quotes that he quoted, and hopefully not by way of repetition, but by way of reinforcement of what he was using and what he was building, and I will do some of the same. And by the way, I will be talking somewhat or thinking somewhat out of my new book, and Jeff had mentioned that, and thank you for presenting it even in church this morning, just beautiful. The books are over there, and you can purchase one if you would like. I understand just this last week, by the way, it was issued on Kindle, so you could go that direction if you wanted to. Be happy to sign them and all of that. But I will be working out of that book. And what I think, while I was not working on the Reformation in this book, what I do think this book for me represents exactly the kind of thing that Mark has been talking about, and that is the recognition so powerfully sometimes that we all feel, everybody in this room feels, that to be a Christian, you are in some ways believing up against unbelief. That unbelief is a part of the context in which we live. It is the environment, it is the culture, and it sometimes comes at us pretty aggressively, as we all know, pushing us on our heels to understand what it means to believe. And as I think about, what got me into writing this book, it was precisely that. I need to say what I believe in this age of unbelief. I need it for myself. I need to think through what it is I really do believe, because the challenge to belief is pervasive and aggressive at times. And so that's kind of where we are today, this afternoon, sort of now bringing all this class. By the way, I just can't even believe the faithful ones here who have stuck with this the whole time. Just thank you for being here and for being interested and being engaged and being curious at the level that you are. It's just thrilling to me. And I've enjoyed it, as Mark was saying. He has so much. I have learned a great deal. For me, the whole process has been, talking, thinking about the Reformation, but restudying in fresh kinds of ways at this moment in our own history, this 500th celebration. So let's step back then. As we're concluding here, as we're coming to this place of review and sort of what does all this mean? What does the Reformation mean? And let's imagine we are all reformers here this afternoon. So maybe you fancy yourself to be Martin Luther. By the way, I got into Martin Luther in fresh ways for me that have really, really informed my own spiritual journey in powerful new ways. So anyway, maybe you imagine yourself Martin Luther. Perhaps Katharina von Bora, or maybe one of the Johns, John Calvin, John Knox, John Winthrop, John Wesley. Or how about William Bradford, Anne Bradstreet, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, all of these incredible figures we've been looking at. So imagine we are somewhere in that mix, in that conversation with people like that. So here we are sitting in San Marino in this beautiful afternoon, looking out across the landscape of our world, looking out over the condition of the church today, and asking ourselves, so what's going on? As reformers, how do we look at this? If we put on the reformers' glasses, we ask the question, so what do we think and how do we respond? That's a fascinating question for me as I was thinking about this session. We find ourselves asking, so what does it mean to be a Christian in our age? And by the way, that's the basic question that reformers asked, wasn't it? What does it mean to be a Christian? I think it was almost always what you will find them is digging down deep into the basic questions. What does it mean to be a Christian in the midst of this world in which we live and a church in which we find ourselves? What does our faith really mean for a chaotic, polarized, disturbing day in which we live? What do we really believe when faith is so much on the defensive, when we as believers are so much on the defensive today? What does it mean to be a Christian? What, from our culture or church or nation, what is it that gets in the way of really believing? That was the Reformers' question too. We see the church itself getting in the way of believing. Martin Luther would say in so many ways, so many eloquent ways. Some people talk about a crisis of faith in our culture, in our time. Is that really true? Do you feel that, a crisis of faith? Some people, that's language that people use. Do we need reform in our church, in the church? What does the church mean immediately when you ask that question? Do we need spiritual renewal in our world? Those are all the questions reformers today sitting in San Marino would ask, I think. These are the questions we ask ourselves, of course. At least I do, and I know you do too. So some of those questions, what we want to tackle as we conclude this course that we've been taking together. Well, we might begin by observing that the church overall is in decline. That's a sobering thing to say, and I am never one to take a very pessimistic view, a very hopeless kind of attitude. I'm never one, but we can say as we look out there and we read the statistics and we look at what is going on, the church is in decline in our country, across the Western world. And by the way, seeing Charlene and James here today, we would say in the global South, maybe not. The explosive growth that they talked about last time is humbling to me as we look at our own condition in the West, in the Western world. Research tells us, though, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of nones. Do you know that term? Those who profess and believe in nothing much at all. The nones, N-O-N-E-S. Loyalty to one church or one denomination is declining rapidly. People move churches. Maybe one of the unintended consequences of the Reformation, even, that people pick up and leave when they're dissatisfied, when they've got, concerns. They go. So that kind of loyalty is in dramatic decline as well, perhaps especially among the mainline Protestant denominations. The Catholic Church, as I read it, and from my Catholic friends, they are wringing their hands too. Maybe especially in Europe, but surely the Catholic Church is asking the same questions about decline and influence in the world. Their presence in a tremendous influence in the history of Western Europe, now in decline, and they are in hand-wringing as well. The church, Protestant church actually, overall, has splintered into 33,000 denominations. And I think we reformers have to stand here today in San Marino and say, is that a good thing? Is that really healthy for the Church of Jesus Christ, that we have splintered so much and that we fight across the splintering gaps? Is that a good thing? We go into battle. I mean, you watch the Reformation unfold, and by golly, they were arguing out all the differences from the very beginning. And it was a splintering process that took off and continued. So So, and battling, even violently at times, battling over these differences. So here we are. Is that a good thing for our time? We're reformers now. What would we stand up to in terms of all of that? Research tells us that there's rampant biblical illiteracy across our land. Let that one sink in. That is a really tough one, but research is pretty clear about that, especially among young people. They don't know the Bible. We're not reading the Bible. As a culture, as a broad culture, we're not reading the Bible. We don't understand the Bible. Most of us in this culture in which we find ourselves have lost a vocabulary, an authentic, a meaningful vocabulary to talk about things like faith and grace and mystery and spiritual reality and prayer. And, we've lost a vocabulary to communicate with that so much in our society. So it's all pretty sobering, I think, the place in which if we're reformers and we really care about the church, that's the premise here. We really care about the church. We care about our spiritual lives. We care about the spiritual lives in our families. We care about those things. So we're the reformers sitting here caring about that. All of what we see and think about is pretty sobering. Then we take even a big, deeper dive into all of that, and we look out across the cultural landscape, and we notice strong, forceful pressures militating against faith. Some of the stuff that Mark has already set up here. We get the feeling, don't we, as Christians? So it's like, well, get real, Christians. Maybe the teachings of Jesus are okay, but really, do you have to promote all that mysterious stuff? These are some of the assumptions of culture that we have to absorb. We encounter all the time. Can we really trust this thing called the Bible? A lot of challenge to the authority of the Scriptures, a lot of it. The authenticity of its formation, a lot of that going on out there. Did Jesus really do what he said, what the Bible says he did? Did Moses really hear a voice coming from that burning bush? And here then in our Easter week, we get the question, why make such a big deal out of that bloody Roman cross? Let's take all of the crosses down. Wherever we can. Let's take them down. So when the resurrection, of course, really, the culture is asking us, isn't it, about all of these fundamentals of our faith? The culture is putting this challenge so much in our face. So it's kind of a gloomy time to be reformers these days. Kind of a gloomy time to be Christians. The odds seem stacked against us too often. But listen, and here's what I want to do. I want to aim us in this direction. Reformers always catch the urgency to do something, right? I mean, as we read the Reformers, they wanted to do something. They wanted to stand up and say something. They wanted to announce the faith. The faith was deeply important to them. The rediscovery of the heart of faith when you read them and understand the unfolding of the Reformation and the Reformations as it moved through history. There was this deep care that we do something. Can we reform the church actually? Can we really make the church contribute to our faith experience or the faith experience of the people more authentically, more effectively? So as reformers, we sit here with some sobering news about our world, but we, as reformers in the spirit of the Reformation, say, what can we do? How can we address this? How can we speak into this? What can we do? By the way, I want to say, I want to lift our church, this church, San Marino Community Church, up as a model. Truly, of course, we always can have things we can do and learn and grow and change and all of that, but I want to lift it up as a model. So I'm saying the church, not always saying my church needs to do such and such. So it's a big, broad picture as a reformer might look at this and be asking this question. So the opening premise, or the main premise, which is Mark has so beautifully set up here, is this, that we do live in a fundamentally secular society. I've been reading all along, as Mark has been reading, as so many of you have as well, all of the literature around the secularizing of our culture, the secularizing of our world. Really going all the way back to the 15th century. I mean, if you trace some of, not just the way the reformers were looking at it, but if you look at the literature that was emerging in the 15th century, coming out of the Middle Ages, you recognize the lifting up of the individual, the challenge of the authority of the church, of course, the challenge of authority of everything, and you look at the beginnings, and I would not always say it this way, but the beginnings of secularization going back that far. I have a section in my book talking about Shakespeare, for example. Sometimes Shakespeare, I remember my father, by the way, I came home as a sophomore with my big, complete works of Shakespeare, and so my dad comes into my bedroom. I'm studying for an exam and reading Shakespeare, and I'm exploring these new worlds that are just blowing my mind, and I'm loving it, and he says, well, was Shakespeare a Christian? And I wasn't quite prepared for that yet. I was, well, I'm not sure, and so the question has been asked forever, was Shakespeare a Christian? And I think, as you see, some of you end up reading my book, I see Shakespeare working on these very same questions of secularization and responding to them in a way as, be careful here, you lift up the individual ego and put that in the center of the universe, and we're going to have trouble. That's a lot of what I think Shakespeare's tragedies are about. That's the way I read them anyway. They're not explicit, of course, as a reformer would be in that period of time, but I think he's coming at it, and the whole cultural movement is coming at it saying, be careful here, be careful moving in a secular direction, in the secularization of things, lifting the individual as the center of the universe. We better be careful moving God out of the scene, in other words, moving God off of the stage and putting the individual in the center of the stage. I think they're asking that very question. I began my book, by the way, with a little story that's become a little emblematic for me, not a big deal in the larger scheme of things, but Sharon and I were living in downtown Seattle. We'd moved out of the president's home on the campus at Seattle Pacific. When you take those kinds of jobs, you have to move out of your house. When you move out of your office, you understand. So anyway, we moved to downtown Seattle before we moved to Pasadena. But anyway, so we're living in as high-rise downtown Seattle, which I love more than Sharon did, but we loved this place. It was just great. We'd walk out on the streets and go to anything and everything, to the Pike Place Market and to the, all these restaurants and everything. But anyway, we got on the elevator one day, and this woman gets on the elevator. We're going on our way out, and this woman says, oh, you must be going to a party or something. And I guess we looked a little too dressed up for Seattle on a Sunday morning. And so Sharon, in her kind way, as she always tends to be, she said, oh no, we're going to church this morning. And this woman looks at us like we'd stepped out of off another planet. I mean, it was like, oh, well, she says, have fun. You know, and I've thought a lot about that, and I've written about it. I mean, again, not to make too big a deal out of a little story, but the point is we face that all the time. It's like, why would you go to church on a beautiful morning like this in Seattle? I mean, good grief, go to Starbucks and read the New York Times. I mean, you know, you know, do something enjoyable, for goodness sakes. You know, loosen up, enjoy life. What are you really going to learn from church? And it's become a little, just a little emblem for me, a little personal experience of saying, oh, we get so many of them, you get them, they're all over the place, we feel them. It's like, where does church fit into the broader scheme of this society? We've been passed by. We're hanging on by a thread. I feel sometimes, culturally now, I'm not saying personally, but culturally, we're hanging on by a thread in this society, in this culture, for all of the reasons that Mark has presented, all the reasons we've been talking about. And that can't be a good thing. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat says, believing Christians are no longer what they once were. An overwhelming majority in a self-consciously Christian nation. The question is whether they, Christians, can become a creative and attractive minority in a different sort of culture, where Christians are competing not only with rival faiths, but with a host of pseudo-Christian spiritualities, and where the idea of a single religious truth seems increasingly passé, not doable. It's not there. There is no assumption within our culture that there is one religious truth, even that there's one truth. So we're living in this world as reformers, as Christians. A writer that I respect so much out of a stunning book called My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer by Christian Wyman. He says, live long enough in a secular culture, long enough to forget that it is a secular culture, and at some point religious belief becomes preposterous to you, atavistic, laughable. I know this was true for me, he says, as he explores his own faith, by the way, in this marvelous book. It's sort of like smog out over Los Angeles. Secularization has sort of spread out over the land. And it's sort of like we try to convince ourselves we're still feeling fresh ocean breezes when it's smog, you know, when it's, this is the way secularizing of our world has permeated and pervasively floats over our world. Okay, so all of that's to say, this is what a reformer in our time has to look at. We reformers, we're that in this room this afternoon. This is what we have to look at and what we have to think about. What would we do? How would we stand up? How would we take our stand? Here I stand. You know, how would we respond to these pressures that seem to try to move Christians to the margins of our society, the margins of thinking, the margins, by the way, and here's the big point, and Mark was making this so well, the margins of presumption, the presumptions, the presuppositions by which we live. That's all being moved aside by a secular society, and we no longer inform those. I was going to read the same quote that Mark was out of Charles Taylor. This, by the way, is the secular age. I know it's big, and I also know some of it is challenging, okay, but I highly recommend it. You want to get a hold of our age, I think it's a beautiful book. Stay with it. Well, who knows whether you will or not. But it is really quite a remarkable book. But I was going to quote the same one, that how can it be, he asks, that we have moved from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. I've often thought about that. I'm going to try to write that something. What would it feel like if we were in an age, if you were in an age and I was in an age, what would it feel like if we were in an age where it was almost impossible, or was virtually impossible, not to believe in God? Do you understand what he's doing here? He's asking the question that that's not the world we live in anymore. Believing in God is only one option about the way that you conduct your lives and your belief and the presumptions by which you live. But the point is, at some point there was a shift. At some point, Becky, I would love to hear you talk about this in the Middle Ages. At some point there was a presumption of belief. I mean, that's Taylor's language. Presumption that there is a God, and then there was, across that divide, there is the presumption that there is no God. Now, here's the point also I want to bring out of Taylor. And he says, the other part of it is that it's not just secularists who have to deal with this presumption of unbelief. Even believers, says Taylor, cannot help looking over our shoulder from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith also in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. I am never, he says, or only rarely, really sure, free of doubt, untroubled by some objection, by some experience which won't fit with my faith. So that's the point. That's the world we live in. Those are the presumptions of what is real and what is true and what is good. Those are the presumptions that we live with. So we too, as believers, also have to face doubt, the questioning, the examination of the alternatives. All of that we have to enter into as well. As I was thinking about this for this afternoon, I was thinking, I wish I'd thought about it earlier and put it in my book, but whenever you defend yourself as a believer, you always have to believe, you have to defend yourself in terms that are secular. The terms of discourse with the secular culture are always done on their terms, on a secularist term. So such things as, of course there is no God. So how in the world could you believe in God? In other words, you're already on the defensive because the presupposition is there is no God. So how in the world could you believe in God? Or, of course there is nothing but material reality. So how could you possibly believe there is any kind of spiritual reality? So you're on the defensive. As we respond to the culture, we have to so prove it. That's the language so often used. Well, that's their assumptions, to have to prove it, and that usually means in empirical ways. So with all of that now, then let's get, as we conclude and move towards conclusion, let's think about how we as reformers might respond, but how did the reformers respond to an age, not like ours, but an age emerging into the kind of secularization we're talking about, or let's put it in terms of confronting a church structure that seemed to get in the way of believing at the deeper levels that they believed we could experience. So, what did the reformers do? I've come to two conclusions about the Reformation, by the way. How's that? I've got two conclusions. How presumptuous is that? But here they are, okay, sort of thinking through all of this. How could we sum it all? How do I sum it all up? Here they are. Here's my first conclusion. When pushed to the wall by spiritual, cultural, ecclesiastical decay and disintegration, the reformers came out swinging, but they came out swinging on the basics. So, does that make sense to you? So pushed to the wall, they're saying, wow, what is, think about the anguishing meditation of Luther in his tower study, saying, this is a mess, I don't know how I can believe, he actually says, in that great passage that I read before, I actually came to hate God because I could never measure up. I could never measure up to a just God. That's exactly what he said. So this anguish, so pushed to the wall with that kind of despair, what's keeping me from genuine faith, he was asking himself, all of the reformers are asking themselves. They come out with bedrock assumptions, with new thinking, with fresh thinking on what it is to believe. They come out with the basics, right? It seems to me that's true. There's no messing around. They take all the baggage that we bring into the faith experience and they say, let's set that aside. What is it really happening when we come into an encounter with the living God? What is that? And how can we do that? How can we experience that better, more authentically, more effectively, in life-changing ways? What is it that keeps us from that? And how can we experience that? What is that experience that we can experience even more? I'm very fond of a great quotation. I'm very fond of Leslie Newbegin, whom Jeff talked about in a sermon last week. And read Leslie Newbegin on this whole thing of the cultural changes and how Christians engage the culture. But he says, this is really a fascinating statement to me and has been for a long time, that he says, what we have to do in our time, in our secular world, where we're presented with these kind of questions and challenges, aggressive challenges to our faith, what we have to do is what the church fathers and Augustine had to do in an age when classical culture had lost its nerve and was disintegrating. We have to offer up a new starting point for thought. And I like that a lot. I think that's where we are. We see, things disintegrating around us. We see all of this and we say, what do we do? And we go, Newbegin says, as the church fathers did, as the reformers did, and we say, here's a new starting point for our faith. Here's the new starting point. Here's a new way of reading it. So I think that's precisely what the reformers did. Think about this for yourself. This is what I ended up, why I ended up writing this book. I had a professor, revered professor, just one of the towering figures of my lives. We all have those. And he told a story about coming to a moment of crisis of faith in his own life. He was teaching at a Christian college, and he was being challenged by his faith, by what this college was portraying as what it should mean to him, and he was debating with that. He was in some sort of dialogue with what it is, what do I believe? And he said he went into the Newberry Library in downtown Chicago and he swore to himself he would not come out until he said what it is he believes clearly, and that he could believe every word of it. So his story, as you can imagine, I mean, this is, I suppose you may have done that. I mean, I've done it all through my life, different stages in my life. Sit down and say, what is it you really believe? Because there are a lot of things being told. I'm supposed to be believing, but maybe I don't. But what is it what is the real core? What are the basics? And he said he wrote down, and he wrote, and he wrote. He's a brilliant guy. And then he said I started scratching out. And he said I started tearing up sheets and throwing them in the trash can. And then I came out with what it was. This is it. I can believe in this. Here I stand. I mean, it's a real reformer's activity, isn't it? And I think that's the kind of, by the way, as students, we always wanted to get a hold of what that was. We never saw his sheets, his final sheets, but I've always lifted that up and said, yeah, that's it. And that's what the reformers did, I think. You think about all of these wonderful writers in the early part of the 20th century when secularization was, as Marcus showed with Flannery O'Connor, was intrusively pushing into the culture. Christians were saying, what is it we believe? You find all of these wonderful apologists, C.S. Lewis cropping up, these G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers. You even look at their books, Mere Christianity. Let's get back to the basics. This is a Reformation spirit, it seems to me. Chesterton's Everlasting Man. Dorothy Sayers' Creed or Chaos? Question. John Stott's Basic Christianity. All of them in that spirit of sitting down and saying what it is. What's at the core? What is it that I really believe? Take all the reading that we do, take all of the preaching that we hear, take the scriptures. Of course, that's what the reformers did, push us back into the scriptures, and then we say what it is we believe. So, what did the reformers believe? And this will move towards some conclusion here. What did the reformers believe? What was the basics? I've been thinking about it. Maybe just because we're trying to summarize. But what did the reformers? They believed all kinds of things. We had how many sessions did you say? I mean, unbelievable. So we've said a lot about what the reformers said. But here it seems, for me, as I've been experiencing that, we get that core position of here I stand, here is the core, here's what I really come out with, here's the essentials. As we watch Luther in his study, in his tower, we are told, it's become an image that in the Augustinian monastery in Wittenberg, here he was in this tower studying the book of Romans. Psalms, by the way, was in that. He was reading it Christologically, of course, as the reformers did. But then Galatians, these books, he was preparing for lectures, and this is where the core occurred to him. This is where the lightning bolt struck him. He even uses that kind of language. And what was it that he discovered out of the book of Romans? Well, we've gone over this. I won't read this long passage, but it is absolutely extraordinary. This is a reflection, by the way, of Luther later. But remember that this experience that he's recounting is happening in 1513, 1514, 1515, prior to 1517 when he nails the 95 Theses on the doorway. This is all happening prior to it. This is the foundational stuff. This is the thing I was trying to argue when we were going through this at that point, is that I think this is the heart of the matter. So listen just to a little bit of this. I won't read the whole thing, but I greatly long to understand Paul's epistle to the Romans. And nothing stood in the way but that one expression, the justice of God. Because I took it to mean that justice whereby God is just and deals justly in punishing the unjust like me. Right? So, I mean, this is what he's feeling, this distancing from God. So how do we become just? I don't get this. And I see a just God, I believe in that, but I'm condemned by that. Not saved by it, I'm condemned by it. My situation was that although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner, troubled in conscience, and I had no confidence that my merit, my whatever I did, would measure up to God's justice, to His love, to His acceptance of me. I've added a little bit there. Therefore I did not love a just and angry God, but rather hated and murmured against Him. Then the lightning bolt strikes Luther. Yet I clung to dear Paul and had a great yearning to know what he meant. Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and that statement that the just shall live by faith. Then I grasped that the justice of God is that righteousness by which, through grace and through sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn, to be changed, utterly transformed, and have gone through open doors into paradise. So I think that discovery of grace is what anchors it all. A lot more to say about the Reformation, about the Reformers, but it seems to me it's the heart of the matter, isn't it? Isn't that the discovery point? Hey, it went on to have all kinds of political, geopolitical, social ramifications, all of that, but here was the heart of it. So what do reformers do when they're back to the wall? They get down to the basics, the very core, the very heart of it, and for Luther it was grace. Right at the heart of it, it was grace. I spent my life trying to find grace, trying to feel grace, trying to understand grace, haven't you? I mean, human nature is we don't measure up. We got to do so many things. We've got to be busy. For goodness sakes, this busyness that so much of our lives is just driving us. We're driving ourselves to try to measure up to something. And Luther comes out of his experience with Paul in the Scriptures, by the way, reading the Bible, being influenced by the presence of the Spirit, and he's saying, it's grace, Luther, it's grace, Martin, it's grace, Phil, it's grace. Open up to it, believe it, you're accepted, you're okay. You remember we talked about Paul Tillich saying, if you are accepted, you are accepted, you are accepted. That's what happens when you're brushed by grace. Well, that's the Reformation. Start of the Reformation, the core of the Reformation. But then I want to say one more thing about the Reformation. There are two things about the Reformation. One is grace, one is this core, one is this transformation, one is personal, and then the other is communal in some kind of way. I think we find in the Reformers always this tendency then to say, okay, if you experience this grace, this lavishly loving God who pours His mercy down on you and me, what do we do with that? Does it change us? Do we become different people? I mean, do we build different communities? Do we build different societies? Right? I mean, so there's absolutely the personal. Sometimes, by the way, Reformed Christians put too much emphasis on that Reform part and get out of balance with this other side, which is to say we've got to do something with it. One of the great books in my life right now have been for many years now, is N.T. Wright's book, After We Believe. And his question is okay, once you believe, now what? Now what do you do? And Christian character formation is one of the great enterprises of biblical faith and Reformed faith. That is, we become changed people, right? We do different things. We live with different kinds of organizations. We create and lead different kinds of organizations. We have different kinds of churches. We have different kinds of families. When we are driven by grace and informed and animated by grace, it makes us different. That's a part of the Reform position too. And for that, I move all the way then into another century also where Mark was focusing tonight, and that is to John Winthrop's, in 1630, his great remarkable sermon, delivered, by the way, on the Arbella, the ship, on their way to New England. The Puritans, there are about 11 ships, by the way, but he delivers this sermon. He says, here's what I think we can create. Can you imagine that, the excitement of that? So we're people of grace. We have been transformed by grace. What kind of society are we going to build? What are we going to do? What can we put together? And this passage just blows me away. It is just so beautiful. It is, as Mark was saying, it is the aspiration of what it means to be an American society. And that aspiration causes us into great grief often because we don't measure up to the aspirations. But the aspirations are that we need to create a society where we love one another, where we treat each other with respect, where we take care of the poor, where we take care of the sick. It's all in there, in this vision for what a society can be. So out of the Reformation comes personal transformation, and then comes this great sense that we can make the world a better place. Get all of this language. Now the only way to avoid a shipwreck, he says, in this venture we're heading out. They're on the ship, by the way. They're on their way. And to provide for our posterity, that is, if we make it past one generation, is to follow the counsel of Micah and to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end. So what does that mean? Will it mean in terms of what we create as a society? We must be knit together in this work as one person. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our own superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. Is that countercultural language in our own day? Absolutely. You know, it is. And it is a statement that we've got to be different kind of people. We need to treat each other in this kind of way. Well, he goes on and on and on. You can read that. And as Mark was saying, by the way, this is confirmed. This kind of aspiration took place. David Hall's work, which Mark has introduced me to, as just fabulous to say. Actually, they were doing it. They took this vision that we need to treat each other this way, kindly, in patience and forgiveness and mercy and care for others. We need to do this. And David Hall demonstrates through the historical records that actually that's the way they form laws, the way they form local governments, formed around such a vision as that. So I say we have one strand that is very personal, transformational. The other is very communal. And it seems to me, as reformers, those are the things that we need to remember. So let me end. So much more could be said from all of this, but let me end by saying, by presenting something to you. We'll feel like we're skipping over centuries here. Of course we are. But Brandon, let's put that picture up there, that painting. This is the painting, by the way, that's on the cover of my book, and I want to explain it. This is Rembrandt's great, wonderful painting in the Rijksmuseum, housed in the Rijksmuseum, which Sharon and I got to see a couple of summers ago. We got a picture of me standing in front of this painting, but this is Rembrandt's, the great Rembrandt, one of the great Dutch masters of the 17th century. And it's called Jeremiah Lamenting the Destruction of Jerusalem. And I made a discovery yesterday. You got to hear this. This. You know when this painting was painted? In 1630. Do you know that Rembrandt was the son of a Catholic mother and a Dutch Reformed father? He was in the swirl of all of what we've been talking about. And so that's why I find this painting appropriate, for what we're in a way to conclude, I suppose. But what Rembrandt is getting at is Jeremiah's writing, so powerful, some of the greatest literature ever written. Jeremiah's reflections on exile, that the temple of Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, has been destroyed. The Babylonian invaders have come in and have deported. One early example of attempted genocide, which the Jews have experienced throughout history. But nevertheless, this is the reflection on Jeremiah's part and on Rembrandt's part in the 17th centuries. Look at this thing. Jeremiah's in tremendous grief. Reflecting, what have we done? This is what the book of Jeremiah does. What have we done? Why do we deserve this? Where is God? How could God do this to his chosen people? We were at once told through Abraham we would be the light of all the nations. And here we are, sitting in the rubble. These worthless artifacts of the temple sitting around on this stump. What looks like the scriptures, by the way, leaning on that, are those worthless now too? It's a sort of emblem of our own age, I think, and it's a sort of, and here, of course, the 17th century painter, a reformed age, thinking on the time of exile. A lot of people are talking about Christians in our day being in exile from our own land. And what do we do? But you look at that painting and you realize there is light breaking through. Now understand, all of the Dutch masters loved light. They loved the light shining in. Vermeer's Milkmaid, that was such a gorgeous, gorgeous painting. They love the light shining through the window. So that's a technique of the age. But no, he gets Jeremiah. I think Jeremiah, when you read Jeremiah, there is the despair, there is the grief, there is the loss, there is the lamenting, but at the same time, there is this sense that God's shining through once again and will continue to shine through into our lives. We can rebuild. I made the statement one time, I don't think you really can see it. It's projecting on this, but he looks like he's got a glimmer in his eyes. We're going to start all over. We're going to reform. We're going to do it. And of course, the book of Jeremiah says that kind of thing. But then what I find so fascinating, an epigraph in my book, and I start with this and I end with this today, is Psalm 137, which is out of the 6th century, so the same time that Jeremiah is writing. So it's exilic literature. It's a psalm, and a lot of the psalms are written out of exile. But I love this. So this is where we are, I think, in our day. And I love the hopefulness of it, the beauty of it, claiming, out of the gloom and the destruction, claiming of a sense of hope and what we can do. What can we do in our society today? The psalm begins, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept. Right, we sat down and wept. The destruction all around us. We're in exile. Our identity as God's people is deeply, profoundly challenged. We don't know whether we can keep this faith. Our society we tried to build as a good and decent society of loving people, it's all in a shambles right now. So by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion. On the willow trees there we hung up our harps. We couldn't sing anymore. All that joyous singing out of the Psalms, we hung the harps up. We had to stop singing. It's not a time to sing. It's a time of despair. It's a time of lament. But then the psalm twists. We call it in literature a fulcrum. The poem moves this way, and then all of a sudden you realize it's moving this way. A crux of a fulcrum, a change. But the psalm says there, those who had carried us captive, they ask us to sing them a song. Can you imagine that? The psalmist says, here we are in exile, in despair. We're under the iron fist of these captors. They're actually asking us to sing them a song. Sing us a song of joy. Our captors actually called on us to be joyful. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. And then the poem ends, this little portion of this psalm ends by saying, how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Well, you know, you could take that last line as being still full of despair. How can we sing? You know, that's what he's asking. How can we sing the Lord's song now? But the other part is a can-do attitude, isn't it? How can we sing the Lord's song? Let's rise up and sing again the Lord's song in a land that doesn't seem to be listening. And what I find so interesting for my own life and experience, and my little encounters on the elevator and such things that we all have, what I find myself thinking is, I actually think our surrounding world is asking us to sing a song of joy. They've got to see us living that, right? They've got to see us living it out. They got to know we have a song of joy. So live it. Create families like that. Create churches that just exude with that kind of joy. But I think the world is looking in, actually, though we feel even despised at times, but certainly we feel neglected and it's kind of an indifference towards what we are as Christians. Nevertheless, I think the world is saying, sing us a song of joy. And that's our task as reformers this afternoon, as reformers all through time, as reformers out of our period we've been studying, as a people of God in exile. We get the chance to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. Well, hey, so that's the conclusion. And I don't know, Jeff, what do you think? Should we take some questions? Should we, open it up? Mark, you want to come up, or you want to, yeah? So any kind of questions that you might have? Or challenges that you might, challenges, huh? Yeah.
You mentioned O'Connor.
Yes.
And the natural progression. Thank you. Making a natural progression of the Christian to kind of lose their faith so that they can find it again.
Yeah.
I was told a long time ago that as you grow into the faith, you lose your child's vision of what Christianity is, and you reject it, and then you then have the opportunity. You can choose, if you wish, to pursue it and go deeper into it. So it didn't seem to me like a big revelation, just kind of a natural progression.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that as you mature in the faith, you sort of realize that it is a choice and a commitment. And I think it involves what Dad's talking about. It's about sort of living it out. So I think you make a good point. You know, in some ways, maybe, if the culture is sort of putting us on the defensive, maybe part of it is not being defensive anymore. Sort of being, sort of living it out and being joyful about it and hopeful about it.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, other thoughts or questions, reflections? Yes, Dick.
Thank you. I'd like perhaps each of you to comment on diversity within the church. There seems to be a growing diversity, broadening the parameters and acceptance of various stages of faith rather than conformity.
Yeah.
And it seems to be happening And whether it's a good thing or not, I tend to look on it favorably. And reality, especially in the light of, as you mentioned, 33,000 denominations,
Right.
split, and resplit.
Right.
And I just wonder where it's going and what will happen in your own mind.
Yeah. Yeah, great question. I think, in terms of my own convictions about that, I think we must embrace the diversity. It's the diversity of humanity. It is certainly the diversity we know in our own nation, though we don't know it perhaps as much as elsewhere. There is diversity, as we heard last week, by the way, of the world picture, radical diversity that we live in and we embrace. It seems to me. But what I think, just thinking out loud here, Dick, I think if the diversity, though, is on matters that are less than the real matters, that then it becomes splintering in a way that can be destructive. And that's when we then start accusing others in various kinds of ways. I think about Paul in 1 Corinthians, for example. He starts out and he says, oh, we're forming these wonderful churches and it's all, I pray for you and it's all so great. And then it gets down to about the 10th verse of the first chapter and he says, but listen, stop fighting with one another. And recognize that all this division, one of you being for one part of the faith, he names off all the figures that people were following, lifting them up instead of Christ. And he says, no. It's the word of the cross that is at the center of everything. It is, we all come in humility, with all of our differences, to the foot of the cross. So there has to be something, it seems to me, at the center that animates through all of the differences. So I don't know. I mean, I just... So are all those divisions of those denominations good for us? Well, they may be, but let's see in every way we can in our spheres of influence to try to bring them together so that we're committed to the same thing at the center and the core. Yeah.
One of the books that I see that Dad brought here is Brad Gregory has this book called The Unintended Reformation. And I think one of his big points there is that these reformers start out trying to reform the church, right? The one single Catholic church. And one of the unintended consequences of that was kind of splitting up and splintering the church into all these factions. So it's almost like part of his argument is that religious pluralism is one of the consequences of the Reformation. And, so out of that, I guess I would say that, we kind of need to embrace that pluralism and sort of have a confident pluralism that the Christian faith can withstand the differences, right, and that can come together and figure out what are the core beliefs that we all share, amidst these differences. So I think, I don't know, that's what I would say, is embrace that and try to find what it is we can agree on, how we can cooperate, how we can live in community together across whatever differences there are.
Great. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Just to follow up on that thought that you raised, I mean, maybe something we should emphasize to a newcomer, especially if they're, say, Asian in our church, is the parable of the well, where Jesus deals with the Samaritan woman,
sure,
and make that a basic teaching, and
sure,
that immediately reveals that from the get-go,
sure,
we are as diverse as you can imagine, because the
sure,
Samaritans, of course, and Judah did not get along in those
yes,
days, not
yes,
on speaking terms even.
Yeah.
And that was sort of, that's almost a defining moment, yeah, of opening up the church to the globe.
Totally, absolutely. And Jesus breaks those barriers every time, always. Can you imagine a more diverse and even combatively diverse or pluralistic world when you've got the Greek influence, you've got the Roman, of course, influence, you've got Jewish influence, you've got then, ethnic divisions like the Samaritans in your example. I mean, all of this diversity out there, and Jesus walks in the middle of that and addresses it all, and brings the focus on himself as the unifying, animating spirit. Yeah.
And one thing I would just add to that is that the power of the gospel is that it does travel. It travels into other cultures and other communities, and it has this transforming kind of power. And so, we've learned about the global church and the global South, and you see how, this gospel message really does kind of work its magic wherever it goes.
Well, I would really agree with that, by the way, because I came away from your session last time just humbled, feeling and listening to your students, just exuberant about, just talk about singing a song of joy. That's what they're bringing into their communities. It's a gospel that has changed their lives, and in fact, speaks, and they speak it. You feel it. Their expression. And I'm saying that's what we need. We need to learn from them, from you all, for sure. So I think Paul over here, and then Charlie will come back to you.
You asked the question, what were the core beliefs? The core belief, when it's all boiled down to a core belief. And when I look at Jeremiah with depression and Zedekiah's eyes burned out by the soldiers, and Job and Jesus in Gethsemane, I think they came down to one core belief, that God will protect you in nothing and sustain you in everything.
Yeah, good. All right. Jan, Charlene was going to...
I just wanted to say, you kind of gave the example of the Samaritan text. When we encounter somebody who seems like the other, and perhaps in this congregation, in this context, when you have an Asian, speaking as an Asian person myself, a visitor as the other, I think one other way that we can approach that text, as we see Reformation as one of decentralizing, right? One of creating chaos, creating the pluralism that we're kind of uncomfortable with when people are thinking new thoughts and new ideas, and we try to measure it to our understanding of orthodoxy, correct beliefs. But in fact, as we look at the gospel, as Mark just mentioned, and as we look at when we see where is God, and we think, is God still moving and active in my life and in my community? Sometimes we're looking for God in the wrong place, because God is moving and active not at the center of things, right, but in the margins where it's the other. So oftentimes we think when we see the other, we make our own assumptions of who is the other to us, because we are the center or the norm. If we can rethink that paradigm and see myself as the other, that I am the Samaritan, right? That San Marino Community Church, that Samaritan story is the one that we also need to hear. And I'm that text of that story, and that I am the other to somebody else. I think that posture of humility is an expression of the Christian faith that shows that God moves and is active and most evident, not where it seems like is the center of things, but at the fringes, at the margins. And if we can move ourselves not towards where we think is kind of the correct thing, but if we can begin to move away from that and move, perhaps we'll have an encounter with Jesus Christ as we see in the gospel. And I think you referred to that text because that is a text of where we see Jesus really welcoming and including and putting himself in the center of the other situation, the other location. Perhaps that could be a place of departure of renewal for the church and renewal for ourselves and for our community.
Yeah, good. Great. Thank you very much. Brandon's got a question.
I have a question, and I wanted to ask both of you about secularism and your views on it. What I've found is, at least in maybe like my generation, that secularism's moved maybe more away from the atheist view of it, more towards agnostic view.
Yeah.
And my thought process has been the Reformation really established personal relationship with God, that it took the Bible,
Right.
learning, prayer into a means of having one's own relationship with God.
Right.
Now, through the years, I wanted to get both your thoughts, especially Mark, you teach at APU, and seeing what students are thinking as they're coming through, that a lot of youth, like in my generation, has learned Christianity by being told Christianity, by being coming up in the church. So it's hard to find faith when you just kind of had it always there and never lost it to begin with.
Right.
So with this new kind of agnostic view that people are very spiritual, is it the job of the church to maybe even get out of its comfort zone, have a new reformation, because these people usually all believe in the teachings of Christ, just maybe have felt abandoned by the church at some point due to the stagnant, vicious cycle of the church that hasn't maybe evolved towards the new way of life that a lot of these people live.
Right.
And I just wanted to see, Phil, your thoughts from studying throughout history, because I mean, in the last 100 years, we've moved leaps and bounds in, consciousness, in technology, and everything, as opposed, I feel like, to the past 400 years before that. And then, Mark, also what you think from seeing these students coming through and their thoughts of philosophy through APU and different scholastic measures.
Yeah, good. You raised a lot of questions there. What I see, I guess, when I see the younger generations coming through a university like APU, I do see a lot of diversity there. I see sort of people that maybe some of them came out of, Christian families and like maybe missionary families or something, but then some of them haven't been connected to the church much at all, right? So you do see this diversity there, and I think that the students are admirably quite accepting of each other and of their differences. And so I think that's a real positive that I see among young people, is that there's this acceptance. I think they embrace pluralism, for example. They embrace the fact that people are going to have different views about things. So, how does the church respond to younger generations? I think that's a real important question, I think one response has been what people are calling the emerging church or the emergent church. A lot of, kind of non-denominational churches are maybe sort of catering to the younger generation. And how are they doing that exactly? I mean, they're trying to kind of turn to like the early church, and what did that look like? I think in part, you may know more about this than me.
One thing I was wondering about that is that you found that through that church, a lot of it plays on emotion of Christianity instead of the theological backing of it.
I think that's
to
right.
Have a further, deeper understanding of your faith and of religion.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. When I look at chapel at APU, for example, it's all about the music. Praise music is huge. So it is this appeal, this kind of emotional appeal, this experiential kind of appeal of worship rather than the intellect. So yeah, I think the church probably has a lot to learn, in how it's approaching younger generations of Christians and non-Christians.
All good discussion. I go back to, I think, the main thrust of what I was trying to say is that I think we need to be careful not to let all of these differences and different practices, as we've sort of broken apart as a church, inform us from the outside in, but locate the center, which I was calling grace, the grace through Jesus Christ, the grace that radiates love and radiates joy from the inside out. Now, I know that can be a simple cop-out to the, I think the complexities of your questions, Brandon, and I don't want to cop out on it, of course, but it seems to me in my stage in life, or maybe the way I look at it, the more I've thought about it, it is from the inside out. That's the way I have such a hard time seeing the church torn over political differences, because I think so often that's the outside trying to inform us inside. And of course, we got to talk about those things. We're living in a polarized, politicized world. I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper with everything is political. Of course, we got to pay attention. Of course, my big theme in life has been we need to engage that culture. We need to be aware of what's going on. But I've come to believe that let us be careful not to let that debate define us from the outside in. That we teach grace, we live grace, we radiate grace, grace of our Lord, and let that shine out. And again, I don't want to be simplistic about that. I know you have to ask the question, well, how do you do that? How do you reach these different splintered, groups out there? But it seems to me the focus has got to be on the central part. Is that copping out? I don't know. I mean, it's just...
In some ways,
by the way, Jeff, I want to say you preach grace. I want to say it publicly. I've said it to you personally. You preach grace. And I can smell guilt preaching a mile off. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want anything to do with a church like that. That's radiating something not grace out of the center when it's guilt producing. And by the way, it can come from the left and it can come from the right, both. That guilt. I remember having a conversation with Jim Wallace, who's one of the, wonderful, left people on the left, evangelical on the left wing. I said, Jim, I stopped reading Sojourners, which is his magazine. I said, I come out of paralyzed with guilt, what I haven't done and what I'm supposed to be doing. And so it can come from both sides. It can come from all sides. But it's grace that's got to start in the center, and we're drawn to grace. All of us are. That's what the Reformers, I think, taught us. We're drawn to grace. We're drawn to forgiveness and acceptance and love, that God lavishly loves us, and that liberates us, it seems to me, to radiate out into the splinteredness that's out there. I don't know. Yeah. So. All right, maybe we should wrap it. Yeah.
Let's thank the Eatons for their leadership and another engaging conversation tonight. And we have so many of the other presenters who are here tonight. So let's thank James and Charlene and Becky and Lee Serling. Lee, our historical figure from a variety of periods. What a marvelous series this has been. And there are so many people who have been a part of it. I want to thank Kathy Van Carnes and the ESD committee that she chairs. Jan has been just a huge supporter of all this effort. So Jan, thank you for your work and for your presence. And Jeannie Caldwell, absolutely. Jeannie, we met in the backyard a year ago, or I guess in June or something, and this all began to take shape from that discussion. So Jeannie, thank you so much for your leadership as well. Now, had I known that the final session was going to be during March Madness with a game on, I wouldn't have scheduled it, but thank goodness we've got recorders that can, but it's been a delightful time, and I think it'd be marvelous to finish this time with a little social together. I think we've got some Kathy, do we have some stuff back in the back or something? So we'll bring that out. And so please linger here for a little while and enjoy some food and the company of one another. But thank you so much for your commitment to this effort. And it has been so good that we're now trying to figure out how to follow up. What are we going to do next year? So wait and see and stay tuned. Let's close with a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious and loving God, we are indeed grateful for your grace. I think of Ron White's comment about early in American history when the churches in the colonies were being supported by the tax base and the separation of church and state began to emerge. There was this fear and the realization that the church would survive based on you, our dependence on you and one another. Thank you that the church has survived. Thank you that it continues to thrive where people depend upon you and one another, where they enter into community together, the covenant community, and they seek to worship and serve together under your leadership. So receive our thanks for this church and for your church wherever it is found. Receive our thanks for learning and history, and for the way you are moving through history towards a redemptive end. As we begin this week of Holy Week, continue to work in our hearts and minds and lead us ever more deeply into the mystery of your presence with us, that we might truly worship you, that we might in a deeper way understand the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and that we might know the power of your love and grace. We pray all this in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.